Hello and welcome to ClapperCast. I'm your host as always, Carson Timar, and today I'm joined by Mr. Editor-in-Chief Jak-Luke Sharp, the good old Nicolò Grasso, and Hilary White as we discuss Bram Stoker's Dracula as part of our Road to Halloween series. Leading up to Halloween, we're looking at modern adaptations of the Universal classic monsters, and this week we're focusing on Dracula, diving into the 1992 Francis Ford Coppola film. Today, we're all pretty positive as we celebrate the production and thematic value of the film, while also getting into some of the negatives and some of the frustrations we have before just talking overall about our love for Dracula's narrative on the big screen and diving into our favorite vampire films. So much happening in this episode, I can't wait to get to it. Thank you so much for listening. Now let's get to our review of Francis Ford Coppola's Dracula. Okay, and I think it's only fair that we start today's episode. So we actually started this Road to Halloween series last week with The Shape of Water. Nick, you were supposed to be there. We kind of slaughtered your baby. We kind of took your baby and cut its head off with that film. So I apologize for that. You should have been there. But I would love if you would now start us off today with Bram Stoker's Dracula, and maybe we'll have a better outlook on this film than we did last week.
Oh, thank you so much. I am honored to kick this off because I do have history with not just Bram Stoker's Dracula the movie, but Bram Stoker's Dracula the novel. I remember growing up, I was always obsessed with horror in the way that many kids are, in the sense that it's scary, it's disturbing, so you keep it at a distance, but also it has an allure. It just keeps calling you to it, and just like, oh. And so over the years, I was always fascinated by all things horror. And one of the safe ways for me to consume it, it wasn't reading books, it wasn't watching movies, but it was reading magazines. And we had this magazine in Italy called Focus, which would do like specific things on art and culture and deep dives and whatnot. And once they had a special on monsters, just in general. And that entire section of this magazine was devoted to monsters in cinema. And I will never forget just like opening this page, and it was the gigantic face of Gary Oldman, like about to bite into Winona Ryder, with the red eyes and the top hat. It was like, holy shit, that's scary. What is it? And it was Dracula. I'd seen a couple of like very simple adaptations, the Mel Brooks film when I was younger, which is not a good movie at all. And then in 2010, I finally read the novel, and I absolutely loved it. I would honestly consider it one of the top 10 favorite books of mine. Also, just like an essential read for me growing up. Uh, and right after, like after a year or two, I watched the movie, and I was blown away by it then. And then I rewatched it on the big screen recently, and I was blown away now. I really love this adaptation. It is very faithful in many ways, but also takes some wild swings narratively, especially with, and this is connected to The Shape of Water in a way, especially in the way that this is at its core a romance. This is something that I find incredibly fascinating in terms of the writing, in terms of the direction. That's something that's this grandiose and bombastic and loud and exaggerated, taking pages from 1920s films, erotic 70s thrillers, and stylized 80s action films. Like it takes a page from almost everything from the history of cinema, and it becomes a celebration of the moving image as an art form and just how inherently romantic it is. And so to take a character as vile and even, racially stereotypical, however you want to describe it, as Dracula, and kind of like turning him into a tragic figure, a romantic figure, it's very bold. And to have this romance, this immortal romance with the reincarnation through Winona Ryder, but also just the entirety of the rest of the cast, how it just goes into some bizarre directions. Some performances are stronger than others, some accents are more believable than others. But I just love getting lost in this film. I think it's definitely not for those who want something that's a bit more subdued, or something a bit more restrained. This is the total opposite of it, and I love it for that. The soundtrack, man, it's so, I could listen to this score every day. It's just so so vibrant and full of life, and takes center stage every time it's featured. It's truly an amazing piece of art, but especially I think it's an amazing piece of cinema. When so many of the other adaptations are, especially when you go back to like the Bela Lugosi version, they're bordering on theater plays, which, good films, yes, the Hammer horror, the 1970s with Jack Palance, like, yes, they're good, but it's always lacking that extra something. Francis Ford Coppola's adaptation has that extra something for me. It is pure cinema. Love it.
Okay, maybe I should go next. Actually, that makes perfect sense because I wrote some notes down here and I thought should go after Nick because I think we are tied together in some ways, and I have to echo some of the things you said because this film came out when I was still a child, and I had a similar relationship with horror that Nick did. You're very drawn to it, but you're also very repelled by it. And because of my age, I was still, as a kid, able to walk through video stores. And when you're wandering around, I would go to the horror section and look at videotapes of horror films and then have nightmares for weeks just from looking at the images on the back of the box. Um, and then the trailer for this film came out, and I don't know where I saw it. It was probably on a tape for something that my parents checked out, I'm assuming. And that trailer scared me so much. I had horrible issues for a very, very long time. I had nightmares. I was at that age where you can't really distinguish fantasy from reality. So I thought that this was real and that Gary Oldman was going to kill me in my sleep. I had made a steak um, and kept it with me in my bed. And then, coincidentally enough, this is years and years later, as adults, I found out that my cousin, who is a few years younger than me, also made a steak and slept with it because she thought vampires were real. And I asked her if she had connected that to this movie, and she didn't. But it was just this strange coincidence that when we were kids, we believed that vampires are real and that they were going to come and kill us as children. Um, so I was really scared of the movie. I also saw images in the magazines, like Nick mentioned, and the image that stuck out to me most was not even Gary Oldman. It was images of Sadie Frost as Lucy Westenra in that wedding dress, and she's holding a naked child. And in the text, it let me know that this was a vampire that fed on children. So I was terrified of her as well. That image was burned into my brain for years, the idea of this female vampire that's too weak and feeds on the blood of kids, infants and toddlers. Just, oh my goodness, I had so many issues with that. So throughout my life, I had to kind of dip my toe in and, forgot about it. And then it would come back, and then I would forget about it and it would come back. I saw a little bit of it on television while I was babysitting some children. You're flipping the channels, and it was a scene with Renfield, and the movie was so fucking bananas. I couldn't even recognize that it was Tom Waits, who I'm a huge fan of. And I've been listening to his music since I was an infant. I couldn't even realize, or I didn't realize that it was him. Um, and I eventually read the book as well. Like Nick mentioned, I have a recommendation here. While I was revisiting this film, I went to my bookshelf and pulled off the copy of Dracula that I own, and I can't recommend it enough. It's a Norton Critical Edition. So if you buy this edition of the book, um, it doesn't only come with the text, it comes with a whole bunch of other texts with it, like the context of when it was written, from the time it was written, reviews and reactions from when it came out, commentary on the film adaptations, and then criticism that has to do with like sex and reverse colonialism, gender, homoeroticism. So if you are a huge Dracula fan, this is the book to have. It is just absolutely insane. And I think that helped me along quite a bit as far as understanding the story. Maybe someday seeing this film, because I was long past the point where I was scared of it anymore and kind of forgot about it. Um, and eventually I did see it. I've seen it several times. And watching it again this week, I thought I coincidentally know so much about this film because it's made me curious that I could do probably a pretty respectable commentary over it if I sat down and actually did it. And I thought that's insane because I'm not even a fan. So there's so much I know about this film, how it was made, what was happening behind the scenes, and eventually I was able to, get more used to it, and I think kind of tamp down on this childhood aversion to it through exposure therapy. And there's still aspects of it that have come up in therapy because I am in therapy. I was just like, let me talk to you about this thing and like what it means to me and what bothers me about it. So that overall, that's been my relationship to it. I think that probably the thing I love about it most unironically is the costumes, which I'm sure we'll get to at some point. And it's kind of a shame because this isn't a possibility anymore. But when I'd go visit my mother in California, she would take me to Coppola's winery, which recently got sold and probably won't be around anymore. But if you went there, the costumes from Dracula were there, as well as like a lot of other memorabilia from his movies. And so I was able to see his costumes and especially Lucy Westenra's costumes. And it was so liberating as an adult to stand and be an adult and realize like I could fit into her costume and that it wasn't scary to me anymore as it was when I was a kid. I really did not expect that to happen. And it was this really kind of amazing moment to be standing with those costumes that these actors wore that scared me for so long. Um, so those are my opening thoughts. I know it's a lot, but I absolutely had to share that and explain like why I'm here.
By the way, anyone wanting that experience at the Academy Museum in LA, they have multiple of the costumes, I believe, on display there. So
Do they have
I guess they
those?
moved. I'm not sure. I don't remember exactly off the top of my head what they have, but I know they have some
Mm-hmm.
Dracula stuff.
Okay,
I
good.
guess the winery closed and they put them in U-Haul and shipped them to the Academy Museum.
Good.
Um, I'm gonna be honest. I kind of feel like I sat down at a party and everyone's talking really about something they love, and I'm like, I have absolutely no history with the film. I have no connection to this film. I don't even really care for Coppola. Really, some good films. I have no like emotional connection to this director. I did the Jak-Luke special and I watched this about 5 minutes ago. It ended for my first viewing. So I have no history with the film is basically what I'm trying to say. I have no emotional connection to this. What I will say is I really like the film. Nick, this is not going to be, at least from my end, another Shape of Water situation. I'm not going to speak for Jack today. Exactly what you guys mentioned. I mean, the lavishness of the costumes, the sets, the visuals. I will say I was initially a little worried for the first 10 minutes because there's like this campiness to some of this film. And initially I was like, am I even watching the right version? Like this feels very like weird tonally, but then it all kind of settles and it picks its direction. A little bit long at times. I think some of the scenes towards the middle is a little dragging here and there. But undeniably, as a fan of the original Dracula film, this works wonderfully both as an evolution and just a remake of it in some ways. I love the little bits of dialogue they pull. I think all the performances are absolutely fantastic here. As far as taking this story, adding a level of human spirit to it, human realism to it, while also evolving the emotions to be this lavish, sensual experience. I thought it worked very well. I was very moved by the film. I was very engrossed in its world. Definitely a big fan here and excited to get into it. But unlike all of you, I just have no memories to share. Jack, what are your history and experiences and thoughts on Dracula?
I'm in the middle of how Nick and Hillary found this film. I remember this is a bit before my time, like maybe 10 years before my time. But I remember this used to advertise on television. I used to go to like bed at like 9:30, 10 o'clock when I was going to school. I remember that because of the watershed in England, you can have like an R-rated film at 9 o'clock because you can say like the F word and stuff, and you can have form of sexual content. After that, you have to go to 11. I remember this used to be on Film 4, which is the same as the production company. They've got Channel 14 in the UK. They used to always, before that Netflix and streaming, we always used to watch that. I remember this always used to show either very late at night or at 9 o'clock as like this Halloween season. And I always was like, it always came at the wrong time for me to watch it. I could never ever make it through. I always remember getting to the Tom Waits scene, and after that I would just go to bed. So for a long time, I never actually saw the full finished thing here until I don't know, maybe I had it on DVD. I know it has a certain history on the Sony Blu-ray, but it's quite a well-known DVD. I come at this probably at the opposing angle of Carson, and very much like Hillary in that I find this fascinating. I have absolutely no relationship with Bram Stoker's novel or book. I don't come from this from a literary point of view. I've seen the Dracula 1931 Bela Lugosi. I've seen the Christopher Lee. I have a former relationship here. The BBC put on a production of it about 4 years ago that I'm going to get into a bit later, because it very much riffs on this. But I come at this more so the compelling nature of Coppola, especially with American Zoetrope, and the issues of Godfather Part 3. So I find this very interesting. I like this. I think it's a really interesting look at a filmmaker who has put himself in a position in which he has to make this a certain way. And while the agenda for this and it's how it's projected is that he used very much like sound stages so he could make it feel uncomfortable and everything would be tighter. And then there's the issue of there's no computer generated effects here. This is because he has no money, because the budget's been blown, because he's $27 million in debt with Zoetrope. Godfather Part 3 comes out, saves him for certain long, and then this comes out and makes, I think, $239 million worldwide. But I sort of come at this position of really enjoying Coppola, going back to the novel. But with Mario Puzo's Godfather, then you go into The Outsiders, then you go into Rumblefish, so on, and then Youth Without Youth and stuff like that. But this is an interesting film in his filmography, not only because he goes back to the novel approach of working on someone else's work and adapting that, which I think is his strongest suit. But this film ultimately is the beginning of the end for Coppola, because there's before this and there's after this. He never quite gets the box office again. He never quite gets success like this again. And I don't think he ever gets the product right ever again. And it's interesting that when you look at Tetro and Twixt, they have Twixt in particular, which I've got a really big soft spot. I haven't seen the alternate cut to that. But when you look at that film and you look at this, they go hand in hand of a filmmaker having to utilize the product he has in a certain type of avenue and certain type of production, which I always find a filmmaker, this is the same man who made The Godfather, crazy. I just find it so interesting. But I just wanted to make one mention to Hillary, because Hillary said that about being so inundated with this. I have 3 stories about this film that I would be flabbergasted if anyone else knew of it. And I'm going to say one of them now, because I didn't believe this was true, but it is. Johnny Knoxville is Keanu Reeves as stand-in in this film. Right, that's number 1. I've got 2 more later on, don't you worry. But I really do like this. I like Winona Ryder. I love the score. But the one thing I want to leave on is that I've got the Blu-ray of this, the Sony edition. I've also got the work print of this, which is an hour and 53 minutes. And it's very, very different in that there's a lot less in it with cut scenes, deleted scenes have been added in, other things have been added out. I've only watched 45 minutes of it because the quality of it is dire. I've had to watch it on an iPad just to blow it up. It's very interesting watching that in the finished article of Coppola, because the edits here I find in his films are very, very interesting and ultimately make or break. I mean, the guy himself can't leave things alone. But this was really interesting to watch. We've done the Universal stuff, me and Newcastle, and we were sort of infatuated with it for a while. And I also think these are really interesting products to go to and have a look at the time, because Christopher Lee in the 50s, you had Jack Palance in the 70s, which is, but then you have this in the 90s. And I think this, as a film, really identifies the 90s practice, whereas the 30s, the Dracula, the Bela Lugosi one, did a really good job of showcasing the 30s theatricals. So I really like that they go hand in hand. And watching this again, that was fabulous. I'm really interested to get in a discussion here. There's a lot to talk about. Keanu Reeves aside. But I'll move on. But yeah, this is going to be really interesting.
And Dracula Untold, don't forget, did a great job showing the 2010s.
We'll get there. We'll get there.
I think probably a good place to start is with the cast and talking about the performances here, because I feel like for a lot of people, that is kind of the star of the show. Obviously, Gary Oldman, Anthony Hopkins, Keanu Reeves is a very stacked list of performances. I will say Gary Oldman, I love in this film. Anthony Hopkins, I love in this film. The one that I wasn't quite sold, I don't know if this is going to be sacrilegious for this chat. I don't know what's going to happen. Keanu Reeves, I thought was not great in this film.
No,
I thought
that's universally agreed on.
Okay. Well, we have some John Wick stands here who can be kind of delusional. They're, who knows what Berlin's doing to their minds. He's terrible. He's bad in this film. He's like the one bad part.
He is, and
it's really sad. It's really sad because he's such a key, pivotal portion of this film, especially towards the end. And it just does very little for me. I thought that was the one place where like everyone is acting up here and then it just like dips. And for me, that was really disappointing.
I can say this. It's once again, like, I do like him. I have for years, even before he kind of had this big comeback with John Wick. I would get in arguments with people about Keanu Reeves. They'd be like, he can't act, he can't do this. And I would disagree about that. But when it does come to Dracula, it's a horrible situation because not only was he miscast, but he did explain years later that he had done 3 films back to back and then was thrown into this one with like no preparation whatsoever. And he was exhausted and it shows. So that kind of gives a little bit more context for why. But in my mind, I think several years back, I was talking to someone about this and I said, why didn't they cast Johnny Depp? Like the 1992 Johnny Depp, because he can play uptight and afraid and overwhelmed really well, as anyone who's seen Sleepy Hollow knows. I mean, that came out 7 years after this, but he could have really brought some campiness and almost like a comedic quality to that particular role. And it didn't happen. Instead, it was Reeves. I will say, though, on top of that, that I am glad he was in the film because the production was incredibly hard, especially on Ryder. And a few years back, she did share that she found her diary from the time. And a lot of the entries were like, thank God Keanu's here. Thank God, thank God, thank God. So he was there for her. And I think it may have been the start of their friendship. I don't know if they were friends before that. But she needed that moral support and he was able to give that to her. So I am happy he was on set for that reason.
Well, I will say, Hillary, according to Amazon trivia, I don't know, the little trivia that pops up on the side of the Amazon Prime, apparently Coppola did want Johnny Depp, but the studio wanted a more popular mainstream heartthrob.
Why did he say he was more mainstream than Johnny Depp? That's what kind of floors me a little bit. But
different times.
It was a different time. I figured he was already big by 92 because of, well, they'd been in Edward Scissorhands together. Maybe they didn't want them to be in a film, like another film right away. I have no idea. It's so weird.
I've always felt the same thing because I think I've spoke to Nick about this, maybe even on a review years ago about maybe just in private about Keanu Reeves here. I sort of agree with the assessment when I don't watch the film. I'm like, oh my god, yeah. I remember reading a Total Film, which is a magazine in the UK, about the worst accents, and he is like number 2 in it. I remember reading about that before I'd even watched the film years and years ago, and it always sort of like, because Keanu Reeves to me was always, as anyone knows, like Neo. So going back and watching like Point Break, I always found really quite interesting to see that it isn't just Neo, it's Keanu Reeves the actor when I was little. So I always found it quite interesting. But watching the film, I don't think it's as much as a problem when it gets going. I think when the film rests on him, he can't handle it. But also to Hillary's assessment, that's true. The 3, my own Private Idaho, Point Break, I mean, like, and then Bill and Ted 2. Like it's an interesting one to go into, and it's ironic that you bring about the cast list here because I think Coppola has stated that it all comes from Winona Ryder, who she wanted to act with, and there's a really interesting irony here, and it all goes back to Godfather Part 3, which is going to get mentioned a lot here. Is that Ryder was going to play Corleone's daughter, and she couldn't do it because she arrived in Rome and she was exhausted. She was in bed for 3 months. She couldn't do it, and she broke Coppola's heart because he'd asked for her to do it. This is just after Scissorhands had come out, so her career was like skyrocketing. But it's before Mermaids, I think. And then then the struggles with Sophia, which is a story in its own right. There's then an issue that stems from them as she gets annihilated in the press. And I think when you look at that story and about her going from exhaustion, and you look at Reeves then doing this, I think it's an interesting parallel in that if she had done Godfather Part 3, I think it would have been even worse than Sophia being in it, because seeing Keanu Reeves and obviously seeing the energy he exudes even now, for him to acknowledge the fact to say he was knackered is probably quite an indictment of how tiresome he probably was. But the cast here is fabulous. Gary Oldman here is genuinely perfectly cast. What a few years he was in JFK in '91 with Oliver Stone. He's just come off working with Mike Lee. He goes into the '90s. He does Air Force One, and a few years later to probably cement himself as a villain. But this is like the first one where it's like, oh shit, like he can play nutter, but he can also play nuanced, emotive, weighted psychos as well. Obviously, Leon comes out 2 years after this as well, so which elevates the skyrocket of his star rising meter. But I think he's fabulous here as well. He probably holds everything together, just because he's absolutely insane in this. But I also think Winona Ryder, I've got a really massive soft spot for Winona Ryder. I think she's absolutely fabulous in here. But it's interesting, like, when you watch the material, it is built on a romance, and it always goes back to that factor of that she's going from Reeves to Oldman. And when you see that relationship on screen with Jonathan Harker and Dracula, it doesn't work just as well as it could do because of Reeves' sort of inability to sort of wrestle with it. He has a great few scenes with the brides, and I think when he's on external, he's quite good. But I think when he's delivering dialogue, he's so he's just stilted. And it's interesting that in the work print, he doesn't show him having a meeting with his boss about Renfield. It just cuts to him going to the manor where she's staying with Lucy, and he's pissed, he's drunk, and like you can just tell he's like he snaps out of it in like 2 seconds. I'm like, that's strange. It feels like a second take. And then they go into the maze, which is ironic when it feeds into the maze later on with Sadie Frost and Winona Ryder. But you can tell like he's giving him a lot of monologue to do, and he just can't deal with the weight with it. And she sort of rescues this a lot, but she rescues it because she's got such a wonderful vulnerability to her as an actress. And here it's a perfect concoction. Anthony Hopkins, I can give and take here. But obviously, Silence of the Lambs, he's like, shit, get him in. But the other issues I have here is that Sadie Frost here, I know Nick has like another soft spot for her. I find that performance really tonally aggravating. At one point it's this, at one point it's that, at one point it's this other thing. You've got Carrie Elwes in here, which is just like, what? You've got Richard E. Grant, who's really good in here, but gets lost in the final bit. You've got Tom Waits. You've got these really interesting concoctions of like, what Coppola likes to do is like he likes to just drop someone in and go. Mickey Rourke in Rumblefish. You've got be it Brando in Apocalypse Now, but more so Robert Duvall in Apocalypse Now. And then you've got like Harrison Ford in The Conversation. It's interesting how he tries to put these people into the stature of the film and accepts an audience just to indulge in that and let the rhythm and the river flow. But I think once you drop that, yeah, you don't change the river, but you can change the current almost in a strange way. It's a strange thing that he implements that I find quite detrimental. It doesn't work too detrimental here because it doesn't linger on them as much. But it just feels like, oh right, that's Tom Waits. Why is Richard E. Grant's then? Like I find it very very fascinating, very fascinating. But I think the cast list here is like it screams 90s as well. It's like a portal back to a time long forgotten. But yeah, really really good stuff. But Reeves' accent, going back to the point, I've never had an issue when I've watched it. But when he meets the initial meet with Dracula, and he's like, have I feel like I've overstepped a boundary, and I'm like, you're trying to do that American British like Tiny Tim thing. A Christmas Carol, like he's watched, Charles Dickens. Yeah, it comes across like really, really stifled, which is interesting because I'll say this. Regardless of Reeves now, 10 years later, 15, 25 years, I don't think he nails that performance at all. I agree with Hillary. I think that's Johnny Depp's. The thing with Johnny Depp is that I think Johnny Depp at that point resents going into the establishment. I think with Edward Scissorhands and then going into Cry Baby a few years later, I think he embodies the identity of I'm not going to go into that mainstream until when he gets into Pirates and then he's lost. So to be fair to him, I think him restricting the idea of going into something massive probably did him the benefit of the good up until that point, and then he just sort of lost himself in that world. Would it have been a different film? Yes. Would it have been better? I would arguably say so. But I don't think you get that Sleepy Hollow output. I don't think you get Chocolat. I don't think you get those films. I think he becomes Speed. I think he becomes in the John de Bont film. I think Johnny Depp's career then turns very interesting into the style. I think it's a perfect film for him. But I think it still works regardless.
Yeah, I'd say I still really like Keanu Reeves in this movie. Definitely the weakest performance. You feel that he's just, he's so tired and punching way below his weight class or above. I don't know. But yeah, it doesn't. I think just Jonathan Harker as a character in the novel, even in the other adaptations, is just kind of a thankless role. He has the least interesting things to do. He's barely even an audience avatar. He's just kind of like there to have Dracula sign something and then just just leaves for the rest of the novel. To me, I agree with pretty much everything that's been said here. To me, the two MVPs are Richard E. Grant. On a rewatch, I forgot just how good he is. Kind of like this almost like heroin or addict, always like twitchy doctor. But also, as the good Jack mentions, Sadie Frost in this movie, Jesus, this is the type of performance that should be star making, and it's shocking that she didn't go on to have a career. She didn't become a name or anything like that, because she owns every scene she's in. And I don't necessarily agree that it's kind of like a tonal whiplash whenever we see her like going from one thing to the other. One element that I really appreciate about this movie compared to the other adaptations is just how, to put it bluntly, how horny it is, how sensual and erotic, unashamedly so. And she encapsulates that element, which is something that's already present in a very light manner in the novel. That's also been present in the other adaptations, because just the vampire itself is a very sexual creature, and it personifies a lot of elements about sexuality and kinks and whatnot. And with her performance, the way she's just this almost emancipated woman at a time when that wasn't possible, where she's, let's say, sexually liberated, maybe is the more correct term. um, and she becomes a victim of that sort of system, of wanting to fit into the, like, have to get married, this is something you want to do, but she's just playing with that in a way. She's very free, and she brings so much energy to it, and especially the chemistry that she has with Winona Ryder is fantastic. But for me, it's the switch once she dies and turns into a vampire, the sequence that Hillary mentioned, which also was present in that magazine I mentioned. And just like, it's haunting. I think when people talk about Bram Stoker's Dracula, the Coppola movie, that's the first image that pops into my mind. Is like her with the white wedding dress or like funeral dress, and just pale with the blood red mouth. It's such a strong visual, genuinely iconic in a movie that has so many moments like that already. But yeah, just I love all of that about that character. And last note I want to say about the cast: Anthony Hopkins is amazing in this film because he's the only one that actually captures who Van Helsing is in the book, which is this very weird, quirky pseudo doctor, you could even say, with all of these things like, oh, I'm into the mistake and just very blunt and matter of fact. While all of the other adaptations change that, They try to make him more like, you have Peter Cushing, a little bit more proper British man. It's like, no. He's a weird freaking weird little guy. And Anthony Hopkins chews the scenery, which is again a type of performance that would derail any other movie, but it just fits with the tone of this one, which is again, as I said before, just bombastic. So many weird tonal balances here that somehow managed to work for me throughout all of it.
I can add a little bit to this. With the cast in particular, I have to reveal this, but it's not several years ago. I think like 10 years ago, my friends and I watched this film together, and I'd completely forgotten about this, and we could not get over Anthony Hopkins' performance in it because it seemed like he was almost operating in another movie, like it was a comedy. So they said to me, because I went to film school, says, "Can you please make a supercut of all of like his scenes and like how batshit unhinged he is?" And I said, "Sure." And I did. And we would watch it on repeat and we would just die laughing because there's so much glee in that performance. He says so many inappropriate things. He's constantly overstepping boundaries. The arc of the scenes he's in, as far as what his character is doing, is like sometimes incomplete or like completely overblown. Um, the scene where he talks about Lucy succumbing to vampirism and that she's now like the devil's concubine, and he starts humping Quincy. Like there's a part of me that thinks that might have been improvised because he did it again in Titus. He started humping Jonathan Rhys-Meyer in the middle of a scene, and Jonathan Rhys-Meyer just went with it. I think that's just one of these weird hallmarks of like when Anthony Hopkins goes unhinged, he just starts humping people during scenes when he's playing a crazy older gentleman. So you have that going on, and then you have Tom Waits. His role, it was strange. I recently came across a video of him doing a self-tape interview for the film that was coming out at the time called Bone Machine. You can find the interview on YouTube in its entirety. It's called the Bone Machine Operator's Manual. And he talks about his experience filming Dracula. And he described a scene where I thought, that's not in the movie, but it might be in the work print, or it just was never included. He said at one point he was screaming in Romanian while being hosed down in the middle of an electrical storm. I was like, where's that scene? There's like elements of that scene or like little bits and pieces of what he's in, but I thought like that sounds absolutely insane. And kind of going back to Keanu Reeves, it's not one of his best roles. And there's something about his early career. They tried to put him in period pieces like this. He was also in Dangerous Liaisons and Much Ado About Nothing. Particularly with Much Ado About Nothing, there's a lot of complaints about him in that, about him being the weakest link, but I disagree with that. The actor I actually have a hard time with is Robert Sean Leonard. He really overacts a lot of his scenes, whereas with Reeves, I feel like he understands the language. The issue is, and I've talked about this with people, is his voice. I said he has that California accent. Mm-hmm. He can't disguise it. And so he can't do period very well, no matter how sincere he's trying to be. And Winona Ryder's voice has that same issue in a way. Like, she has a beautiful period face, but even with the British accent, it does sound modern a little bit in this film. And her journey with this film is quite interesting. You can find a lot about it online, but she's the reason why this film happened. She offered the screenplay to Coppola to make it up to him because of the Godfather Part 3 debacle. And another piece of trivia for her participation in this that I found interesting is, I think for a long time it was reported that she was experiencing exhaustion. And we hear that quite a bit with celebrities who are overworked. They say they're suffering from exhaustion. With her, it went further. She ended up in a mental institution for a while. And that ended up informing the project that she ended up shepherding herself several years later, which was Girl Interrupted. It was that book. It was given to her in galley format, I think, even before it was published. And she thought, oh my God, that happened to me, just being committed and scared. So that ended up, that kind of links those two projects together. And then lastly, I have to say, with Gary Oldman, saving him for last, he was going through an incredibly hard time while this was happening. He had just divorced Uma Thurman, so he had kind of lost a young bride. And if you look up pictures of Uma Thurman in 1990, 1991, we're talking like an absolutely beautiful young girl. Um, so it adds context to scenes like when Reeves asks Dracula, like, "Are you married?" And he said, "I had a wife," and he cries. There's a lot of things going on that I think it was easy for him to pull from. And he also had issues with drinking that may have contributed to a reported fallout with Ryder on the set. They said something happened when the cameras weren't rolling off camera, maybe off set, where something happened that scared her. And she was really averse to acting or being comfortable around Oldman. Since that happened, they have reconciled and they're friends now. And she did mention that it did have to do with the fact that he was not sober at the time. So I don't want anyone to take anything from what I'm saying that there was like a sexual assault or anything like that. I don't think that was the case. I think something just happened where he was really drunk and it freaked her out. And that's completely understandable. So there's a lot of like instability and grief, and I think in some ways frustration as well. It's easy to find the behind the scenes featurettes on YouTube of how they made this, and there's so much footage of Oldman and Coppola disagreeing, or Coppola just being tired of Oldman asking questions and Oldman struggling with the costume. Like that muscle costume, it's all plastic, and they have to take all the sounds out because it was like when he'd move around and like parts of it are falling off. It's hilarious. So definitely, if you want more context about just how nuts this movie was and at like what the cast was going through, knowing that now, you'll see so much of that happening while you're watching. And it's amazing that I don't know. I don't know if Oldman and Ryder had chemistry. I sometimes really struggled with that. It is really an odd pairing, but I guess for some people it works. Some people just love that love story. And for me, I'm not as big on it. The kind of Beauty and the Beast transposing onto this where it's like, oh, he's in love with her. I just like the idea of Dracula being evil for no fucking reason whatsoever. He's like, I'm just gonna show up and ruin everything. So
I mean, on those behind the scenes, I think he's like that sequence you're talking about, Hillary. Like he like breaks character. He goes, Francis, Francis, Francis. I can't say this shit. I can't act this shit. I think it's quite well documented. He's had issues with alcohol in the past. I think there's an interview from the mid 2000s where someone's interviewing him about his like best. I don't want to give the year because he could have been recovering. I don't know. But there's a time frame where they ask him about The Fifth Element. They ask him about Luc Besson, which has aged particularly well, depending on how you think of Luc Besson. But for no apparent reason, he just calls him a CUNT. So it's a very strange thing that like he has. He changes his mind constantly about like how he processes things and how he talks about one project then to the other. And for a long time, because about this alleged, and you've got to say alleged about the incident. I've heard it's an alleged that he either got his todger out and simulated an act to get her attention, which is when she first meets him on that London High Road, or he simulated it with a vegetable on the stall, and that's what she was disgusted about. But his alcohol problems are quite well documented. But that to me is like Gary Oldman at a certain point in time where I think he comes from a very incredibly working class background in the UK. If you watch his directorial debut, I believe it is, Nil by Mouth, that's literally a film about his family. Ray Winston plays his father, Kathy Bates plays his mother. It is horrifying to watch, which is actually all financed by Luc Besson as well, which is even more interesting. But that's his family life. And I'm not excusing anything here, but you can tell with him as a processor going like working class going through the UK, working with Mike Lee and stuff like that. And then, Letters to Brezhnev with Alfred Molina, working class, stuff like that. And then there's a time frame from, and it probably maybe before the Uma Thurman thing, but he works out his issues as an arsehole, playing arseholes for a long period in the 90s. I think that's definitely a projection of his own insecurities and his own anger of trying to find common ground with himself as a person, as well as the issues he has, and the outcomes that he's probably created for himself. And I think they don't really stop, probably until Harry Potter as well, which is interesting because that was his comeback of like, oh, he's going to do a very family oriented role, and even then he's made comments about how like he didn't really like that it was all hidden secret and stuff like that. But then you have Batman Begins a year later, which then cements him, and from then on, I think he's doing all different. But it's interesting to watch such an interesting character study like Dracula, because you said, Nick, I think it was you, Nick, that it's like this is a romance first and foremost. And I think it is. It most definitely is. I think that there's a romanticized element of this about someone who missed an opportunity in time, is then poisoned with time itself, and then is trying to, or the one thing that makes him human, with his sense of Dracula, is this person who's the embodiment of a lost love. I think that's the romanticization of it. Everything else is the fact of like lust, greed, envy, and that comes out really well in this relationship. Because, like Hilary said about, you could probably argue these two don't even have chemistry, but it's that writing, it's that damned writing about a character who is just you have like this weird. Maybe this is just me, my perception of it, but there's like a sliver of hope watching this when he goes to London, regardless of the horrible things he's done, the multifaceted character of the craft. When he sees Mina on the street and he stops, there's like a sliver there, like, oh my god, like maybe this is a turn. But even to his own ego and his greed and his lust, partly because of his vampirism, it's interesting how he even poisons that. So it's really interesting character study, but I think it more comes across like that point of view where we're watching someone who is just, there's a human paint there, there's a human texture, a dabble of humanity underneath this really thick, oily, ghouly type of substance, and it's just that poison, that nastiness, that nihilism, that sadism that comes out of the actual the vampirism of him being Dracula that like poisons everything. I think it's really interesting. It makes the romance spike a bit better, but it also makes those horrible sequences with Sadie Frost and how he with Jonathan Harker to be really, really grotesque. And the reason why, to go into something else, I don't know if anyone has seen the BBC a couple of years ago did I think it's a 3-part retelling of Bram Stoker's Dracula.
Oh yes.
Yeah. And the villain who plays it is like the spit image of Bela Lugosi. I can never remember his name. It's an interesting
Norwegian Danish guy.
Yeah, I think he's Danish. You'll have seen him in a few bits and pieces. He has like this.
Weissbang.
Yeah, Weissbang, but he has like this hair where it's peaked black. Really good iconography of it. But they do something quite interesting, which is a riff on this, in that they take the Bram Stoker's novel, and it's interesting from the perspective of the social society dynamics now, having a look at it. Because I think that's very much heavily inspired by Gary Oldman here, because it's inferred in this 3-parter that he rapes Jonathan Harker, and he gives Jonathan Harker a sexual disease that kills Jonathan Harker before Mina can ever find him, because he dies in a convent, which is interesting testament to the idea of the blood and AIDS, which then this is an interesting allegory for it as well. But it's an interesting, like I said, riff on it. Like he sexually assaults Jonathan Harker, like nothing stands in the way of him poisoning everyone. If it's sexual assault, if it's sexual liberation, if it's greed, it's lust. But they do something interesting in a third act twist when the Dementor lands. I won't spoil it for anyone because you should watch. It's interesting. It's okay. Like it's not brilliant, but they do something interesting with the twist. But the dynamic there is they do a female Van Helsing, because that's the BBC for they can't change too much, but they do the gender swaps and really add nothing to it. But it's an interesting dynamic. I'll say that at least. But back to the point. I think that this is an interesting one. Where we've spoke about the Lugosi so much, me and Cass, and like we did the Universal James Whale. I think the time has passed now with that. I think that's an incarnation that is looked at as an item of pop culture that is somewhat referential, but nothing in the mold. I think this is such a staggering use of iconography. Like Hilary said, with the costume design in the opening. Oh my god! Like how beautiful does that look? Like the armor they use, everything throughout. Like it just looks so like it just looks perfection. But the armor in particular, which they tried to do in Dracula Untold, but we don't talk about Poison just yet. I think it's an interesting one. But I think the 1992 Dracula is now the staple of the character. I think people are back to that, which is an interesting one because I think there's a 60-year difference, and there's a 32-year difference now. So in 30 years' time, there's going to be something else, let's say, for another incarnation. I think this is so strong. I think this gets the character on such a really horrible, unnerving value. I think this will probably be the one. I can't see anything touching this. So that's how good I think Gary Oldman is here. He's absolutely frightening in this. Like just the opening. Like I tell you, I'm going to stop talking in a minute. I do apologise because I don't fucking do this all the time. The one thing Coppola made a mess with is the opening, because in the opening of the work print, Winona Ryder really isn't in it. They don't see her jumping off. They don't see her dying. We don't see the arrow arriving. He just goes to battle with an on-screen thing, and the title card's horrible. It's green in this one, but the one thing they missed is that when he speaks, which I believe probably would have been Romanian at the time, or Transylvanian, but it would have been Romanian. The one thing that he should not have done, he should not have put them. He should not have put it in subtitles. That sequence of just venomous, emotive anger, of just desperation, of just grief. If that was just him speaking his mother tongue, and he didn't subtitle it, I think that works so much more powerful, because we don't know what he's saying. We don't know he's recanting God. We don't know what he's doing. We know he's going through a serious traumatic experience of like, there's a PTSD, there's a Macbeth there as well. But for him to subtitle it to me, I'm like, really let the external work. We don't need to subtitle it. There's the one thing I just don't really like about it, but bar else, I know that's nerdy, but bar that little tiny snippet, I think it's fabulous.
I have to agree, actually, because I watched this movie at the cinema here in Germany, and it was an English language screening, but the subtitles were in German. And so for the parts in Romanian, it was in German. So I was like, I'm just going off what I remember from like 12 years ago,
though.
It works. It works just emotionally, intuitively. But because everything is so much larger than life, just the power of the image itself speaks so loudly in the performances. It's amazing.
And the irony is that he relies on that image so much throughout the feature. He doesn't need anything to explain to it. You don't need to know this is blue flames going off. Although in the deleted scenes in the work print, that's where buried treasure is. So they stop the card to put a rock on it, so he can go
that's
back
from the novels, sadly.
But he doesn't need to contextualize the sequences. We go into that with the train, and we're like, oh my god, because that's not Coppola. That is not a Coppola that you've seen before. That's not a Dracula visualization. That's just something completely different. Puppetry, miniatures, use of glass, use of smoke, very much bare bones. I think going into that, he doesn't even contextualize any of it. That's what you are presented. You need to deal with that. You need to process it. It's fucking with your mind, pardon the French, and you're going to have to process that as just reality, just like Jonathan Harker is. Oh, that is Francis Ford Coppola, ladies and gentlemen. That is a filmmaker of the 1970s. But then to contextualize the rage, I think he sort of gives it a little bit of a disservice to the not only to the Gary Oldman performance, but really sort of just the language and the rage of just the image. But anyway, that's getting to it. I get too nerdy. I need to resist. We'll get there.
Well, no, but what a powerful testament to the power of the image and the power of just like, and not to like give the simplest take ever, but you mentioned the costumes, also the production design. There was a video circulating, I think it was this week. I don't know if one of you sent it to me or if I just randomly stumbled upon it, but it talked about how production design in the age of streaming has been like largely reduced to where you don't want complicated sets or you don't want complicated color schemes because it won't play well on a phone. And like watching new content this week and just in general, and watching something like Bram Stoker's Dracula, where you see the complexity, you see the beauty, you see the texture in it all. You mentioned the scene where she's in white, Nick, and the makeup on that. The iconography is so tangible, so effective here. Bela Lugosi's stare is obviously like, and just face is obviously iconic. Probably the most iconic piece, one of the most iconic pieces, let's say, of horror iconography ever created. The artistry and the sets and the costumes and the colors and the set pieces here are so memorable and so strong. I agree with Jack that this is probably the definitive, even past thematically what this presents, which you've all said wonderfully, just visually and creating an image of Dracula. This is easily, in my opinion, probably the defining entry into that. And it's so sad going back to like the 90s and seeing how good we have it. Cause like now it would not be this beautiful. It would not be this elegant. It would not be this extravagant in some ways. There is, again, little pieces of campiness here and there with that, but I think it really still works and overall holds strong. That's what really blew me away is, yes, I think the thematicness here and capturing the complexities of Dracula is done better. I want to read the novel. I've never read the novel. That is done wonderfully, showing this tortured image where he is evil. He's undeniably venomous, but he has that heart to him. He has that point to him. But the artistry and the visual language of this film really is what sucked me in and compelled me. And it's definitely what I will remember. I will remember the shots of this film. I will remember the visuals of this film. And it's something that's going to be interesting going through this series. You know, these are not connected reviews in Road to Halloween, but talking about how we portray iconography. We talked about that in Shape of Water to maybe some disappointment. It'll be interesting because I think this is the earliest one we're talking about. We're talking about a lot from the 2010s, a lot from the 2020s, seeing how that evolves. But it just comes together so beautifully. It really stood out to me.
What I said earlier in my opening about like this production is conscious or not, I think that's debatable. Like I said in my opinion in the opening, I think this is a conscious decision because he has no money, because he can't afford it, because he can never make something on time and he can never make something under budget. And I think the production from watching a filmmaker in the 1970s and then watching it like 20 years later and him what seems to be seamless conditioning to like, oh, he can make this, like that's to me is unparalleled. I think that's an outstanding touch to have, but it's definitely one where the limitations bring the best out of creativity. There's only one film I've seen since that, and I had the absolute pleasure to watch at LFF a couple of years ago. I don't know if anyone, because the first film I was like, watch this, and there's only one film I've ever found to be close to this. I would probably say it's better, is The Tragedy of Macbeth by Joel Cohen. And I think that's a director who takes a very similar production design, but consciously implements it to elevate the material as barren and to really spike in the fact that this man is a lonely, bitter, and mentally unwell person and things are slowly but surely unraveling. And that he sees it in black and white as it's in life, in that right or wrong. Because during his decisions and his wife during the film, again I go back to the Macbeth thing with Dracula anyway, but the stylistic aspect of that film works so much wonders, and that a man egotist sees things in black and white, and life isn't like that. And in here, it works in the other way, and that you've sort of got this fabricated aspect of, because I love the idea that Coppola does this and says, you know, Dracula, this is a character that is not an embodiment of Earth. It doesn't come from Earth. It's a supernatural thing. So why should the setting be brought back down to reality? We can elevate that, and how he does it with shadows, how he does it with again with like the mirror sequences, and there's a hand comes in, moves something before the shadow does. There's so many little details and tricks that feel would probably be a miss on a first run through, on a first draft. But the fact that he got it the first time and implemented these small but such infectious elements of just unnervingness. I think that's what fucked me up as a kid. It'd be interesting to get Hillary's point of view. It's that noticing that type of shit. I was like, because it's like it's one of those things so subtle. Like when he goes to get Mina's portrait, and the something before it, the shadow moves something out of the way, and his hand goes down, and there's something like that where you subconsciously accept that as not happening, but obviously consciously in your mind you do. And if you can grasp that on a first viewing, God forbid, there's a really wonderful uncomfortability with that, in that you look around and you ask yourself, did that happen? Or is that just me? And I think that's such a wonderful, flamboyant texture to this film, in that it sort of double guesses you as an audience. And watching that as a kid severely fucked me up, because it was one of those things where you do question yourself. It's one of those films where, with narrative, it's so linear in a way. What's on screen, like, your Jimbo, you can use a non-linear, and you can use plot as an interesting parallel to, like, perspective. Last Duel, Ridley Scott. There's an interesting parallel there. But in the moment, in the image, you can't second guess what's presented, because we can just rewind it, break the mirror, and we can see it as fact. Whereas this works in such a meta way with the context of the film as well. I think it's one of those. It's probably my favourite aspect of this film, actually, watching it again. It's so spooky. It's so unnerving to watch. It's fabulous. And I would love to have seen that on the cinema with the production design and the audio, with a terrific, horrifying score from a musician who never worked with Coppola before, never worked with him again, only does sort of Romanian television. Like, what a damage. And that opening sound, like, to start the film, oof, such like 1930s, such Lugosi, but that stands on its own 2 feet, yeah.
I will say a little connection, same production designer as Crimson Peak.
Oh yeah.
Well, yeah.
Beautiful.
Jessica Chastain has mentioned quite a lot about this film, hasn't she, an influence? Well, enough about that. Crimson. I love the filmmaking here. Like I said, I love the fact that when he's shaving, the room is slowly getting tighter. It's just small, very minimal. There's a constant thread throughout that summer blockbuster. Less is more. Less is more. Watching, ironically enough, Michael Keaton and Beetlejuice for 16 minutes. Less is more. And I think with Bruce the Shark, less is more. I think when you see this, it's not less is more an iconography, because you can't get the fact that he shows you Dracula, he presents you as Dracula. He doesn't hinder you to be like, build you up into it. We just sit there, we see this person. I think it's a really interesting design, because now, with the likes of Nosferatu, with Eggers, they're resisting the urge of showing that. They resisted the urge of watching Nicolas Cage's long legs for the longest of times, and we probably won't get to see. We probably won't get to see Nosferatu in the flesh until that first ever screening. But like long legs as well, they resist the urge to see it the first time. These fuckers, poster, trailer, DVD cover, it's bang on straight in the film. We get the full presentation of this old decrepit man. And I think by allowing us to be engaged with it very early on, that unsubtlety about it really works wonders. But again, the small intricate moments of just the room getting tighter, the minimal aspects of it really work to what is an interesting dissonance that a larger than life production, ironically or not, is very, very, very down to earth, very minute. A fact that sort of weirdly escaped Coppola after this. You go into Youth Without Youth. You get into The Rainmaker. Like, he goes into these bigger, more dramatic features, and he only sort of got brought down to earth with Tetra. I mean, the guy's like doing second unit filming on Supernova with Walter Hill. I don't know. Didn't save it. But then you get to Tetra and you get to Twixt, and I'm like, that's the filmmaker. I think that would have been $30 million budgets. I think Coppola would have been added such a rich filmography now. But now we've got the likes of other things that are very worrying and frightening. But yeah, the one thing I wanted to add here, which is not a little bit of a thing, when did his son die?
Because I think that was long before. I think that happened in the 80s, if I remember right.
Because he struggled with that for a long time, and I think Twixt, which is 2011, very much as a man, like, I admit he misses his boy, he misses his son. If you ever read about that accident, it's horrifying.
Oh yeah,
May
it is.
20, May 1986.
Yeah,
Yeah, and I think when you watch The Godfather Part 2, because Gardens of Stone comes out in 87, which is like a military feature about people going back, dealing with certain things. I think James Earl Jones is in that with James Caan, I believe. I could be wrong there, but I'm pretty sure that's correct. So 87, and then he makes Godfather Part 2 in 1990, sorry, and then this 2 years later. I think there's definitely, like we spoke about Ridley Scott earlier, Cass, about there's very much dealing with things on the cinema screen, very much like Gary Oldman was. And I think this is just dealing with death. This is dealing with dealing with the living who are dying, or who are dead, who I think who are acting as a, I don't know if I can get that quite right, but it's interesting that there's these three films that follow that, and it deals with death is a looming subject. Coda, the death of Michael Corleone, Dracula, the embodiment of a living, breathing, walking Grim Reaper, and the tragedy about trying to find love and being dead. Everyone's like the Walking Dead, essentially. They're alive, but nobody's living. And I think this is sort of a really interesting aspect of that, because I think he very much found that difficult, as anyone would. And I think that texture is very much compelling in these features that followed his life, even after the fact.
one thing I can add is I'm not exactly sure where I read it or if it was just an interpretation. I'm not sure if Sofia Coppola said this herself, but there was a lot of speculation that her debut, The Virgin Suicides, was a way for her to deal with her brother's death. And
Oh, I don't. Yeah.
I wouldn't be surprised, but I don't know if
Yeah.
she said anything. I think it may have been something that was conjured by the press at the time because it is about young people dying senselessly. So,
Yeah, and especially with, I can never say it, megalopolis. What is it? Megalopus. I can.
Megalopolis.
I'm glad. Whatever it is. I'm glad we're not doing it on the slate anyway. But it's going to be interesting watching that as a filmmaker coming towards the end of his life, or even his career, let's say, about trying to retool a world to live in. I think it's an interesting one. It's an interesting form of things. But I just want to. I know I've talked for ages here, but I just wanted to add something else to it as well. Is that I told you I had like three things. I only have two. The second one's really interesting. I had to second source this. There's a story about Sadie Frost here. I don't know. It's a bit out of tone, so I do apologise to the listeners and to the three in the call. But there's a story where in about 2014 she had an interview and they were talking about the making of this, and she said that she was in the hair and makeup. She did her hair and everything, and it was 3.5 hours, right? And she came out, and there was an assistant, and the assistant says to her, Miss Frost, Mr. Coppola said that your hair and beauty are here. And she's like, I've done my hair and beauty. And she's like, no, it's not for the upstairs hair. And she sort of went, what? Went back to her trailer and was like, what are we doing? Why are we doing this? And from she'd had to had, and this, I digress here, but I'm laughing because it's uncomfortable to talk about, not uncomfortable act, but because of how she was presented on screen, they had the touch up a pubic region, because it could have been caught on screen. And there's a lot of, it's interesting about that and reading about certain things. Not saying they're connected, but it's an interesting aspect when I read that, and I was like, is that because I had to second source because I thought, is she taking the piss there? But apparently that's true. They didn't want to airbrush in post because they didn't want to do any digitalization of the film. So they had a hair and beauty assistant come in and touch up her pubic region. So if it was caught on screen, it would be presentable of the 1800s in which it's set in. And it's interesting when you watch Sadie Frost's performance, because I think Sadie Frost, regardless of the tone here, has to deal with a lot of shit on this film. There's a lot to go through for a young actress, And the fact that there's an introducing credit here, I thought was interesting because she'd done 6 films before this, which I was like, that's a strange one. There's a lot to be put forward in film, and ironically enough, I don't think any pubic region was touched on the likes of Keanu Reeves or Cary Elwes in this film. But it's interesting that like she puts a lot of image on, presents a lot of her own private image on this screen. A lot of sexualization of like breasts and stuff like that to intoxicate other characters around it. It's an interesting conversation to have about how much is relevant on screen, how much is needed, because I think you can get through all of that without those small little things. But it's just an interesting aspect of the texture that they put forward in here, and not when I talk like banning all like sex and stuff on screen. After I read it, I remember just thinking back to the film, and she presents a lot here, and I asked myself, is it worth it? And she says in an interview, I'm on a Francis Ford Coppola movie, and it just sort of like, not to bring the tone down, but it just sort of like reminded me of like just people feeling forced to present privacy in the form of cinema for an auteur, because that's what you would do. And I just look back and I'm like, I don't like that. I don't know. Maybe I'm getting long in the tooth. Maybe it's my age. But
well, there's also the story, if you, again, Amazon trivia, so, I haven't second sourced this, but the wives of Dracula didn't want to get naked, and Coppola had to, like, bring in people to, like, convince them to get naked, which is very odd and not needed, and then, pair that with other stories, which are part of the reason we're not reviewing Megapolis today.
Monica Bellucci's a bride there as well. And one of the Romanian historians plays one of them as well, which is I thought was fucking interesting. But yeah, there's a lot about presentation, about image on here, and sexuality, and it's a lot of the female form is presented, and there's a little bit of the masculine here as well. But it's an interesting one, because when you look at the again, the BBC production, that takes very much the male aspect of it and presents that on screen, which I think is produced by Mark Gatiss, who's openly homosexual as well, who did Sherlock.
It is, yeah.
Yeah, which is an interesting parallel there about you can't even use that as a. You could probably say the male gaze there is interesting, no pun intended, but it's an interesting one to look at and see that projection. Come on, you can smile, Nick. Is it? But yeah, going back to the point, for an actress to put so much on screen and to see that character, you probably would, as a writer, you'd be like, oh yeah, she's very openly sexual liberated. But there's a lot of like them two kissing in the maze. There's a lot of I tell you that there's a very interesting male gaze here from Coppola, who has been renowned, like you said, Carson, in the last few years of it, and it's interesting. There's nothing to it. I'm not trying to like get too much into it. I find it very interesting as of late. There will be that reading now after the is it the Variety article came out, which we might not be able to say anymore because they're currently getting sued. But there'll be a lot of reading about Coppola after that, and I think it was just interesting, the parallel, to hear that story and hear it from the actual person rather than it be like a funny quip or like, yeah, we had to shave Sadie Foster's pubic region, like, because it might show like the Sigourney Weaver thing in Alien. It's like, oh, it's funny. Like, well,
not really. No.
Yeah, is it? Yeah, it's a strange one, and it always comes from like the director, who happens to be, no holds barred auteur. An interesting parallel, I suppose, but I'll let Carson move that one on.
Yeah, maybe moving on from that. Not to spoil any episode of any podcast that might come back next year, hopefully. But I am curious, for the two who've read the novel, how does this work as an adaptation? Is this like very faithful? Do you think this captures the novel? How are your reactions to that?
I think it is definitely very faithful, despite having, as previously mentioned, like the entire romantic angle is not present. Dracula, you could even say, is barely a character in the novel because it's told in an epistolary form, which is also employed in this film through the audio logs and the diaries and the letters. I do like that this adaptation ultimately does its own thing. It goes in its own different direction, and I don't know, it just complements the original text while also bringing it forward. And I think it's been, I want to say, like 110-ish years from when the novel was released and this film came out in cinemas. It just fits for what the 90s were and the coming decade and new century of just society at large. It's a fascinating one. I'm curious to know how Hillary feels about
Oh
this, the
yeah.
adaptation itself.
It's not like Nick said, it's not a completely loyal adaptation. The book is quite different, and the choices that deviate away from the novel are probably what make this version the most memorable, especially the romantic angle. And I think, especially reading more about this film, I think what holds the most power is how it affected things afterwards. That vampires did become more romantic figures in the decades that followed this film, and it's not necessarily the an angle that I'm the most fond of, I have to say. But it does make it unique, and I think it did pave the way for other films that people love just as much or even more. Like if you think about Interview with a Vampire, that's an incredibly romantic vampire film, and a lot about yearning and eternal love. And even though I don't love the romance in it, that line in this film where he tells her, "I've crossed oceans of time," Jesus Christ. I mean, I'm not a romantic or anything like that, but I'm like, what a line. What a great line. My God. That would work on a lot of women and gay men too.
I want to make it very clear, if anyone wants our thoughts on Twilight, we're not getting into them this episode. Jack, I see you over there writing your essay, getting ready for it. We're not doing Twilight today. Shut it down.
No slander. Don't open it up for me.
Oh no, I wasn't going to go there. I promise.
It's fine.
I was sticking to the 90s. That comes later.
I do want to mention slight negatives here because I think it's just been too positive by the last story. I do agree with Carson about the pacing, and I have like a double-edged sword here. Partly because I've never really seen the latter half of this. I've seen the first half so many times. I've always found it quite interesting. But when he gets to London, I've always found that to be slightly. It just becomes to be quite drab and droll from that moment on because it changes, I suppose, tone from something that's quite immersive in production design and energy. It changes genre a little bit to the romance, which I have no problem with that. Like I said, those poems I quite enjoy, but I find that it has an issue from that moment because it spends so much time at the beginning in very long, elongated sequences. If it's Sadie Frost and Winona Ryder's relationship and the dynamic there, which adds texture to both, or it's the Jonathan Harker, Keanu Reeves, and Gary Oldman thing. It sort of splits its time to a two-pronged narrative. When he gets to London, it is the London narrative, and everything else comes at like very much scattershot. So then you get the Richard E. Grant with Renfield. That's a small, but it's like it just there's not enough of it, which I also agree with Nick. I really like Richard E. Grant in here as well. Probably like fresh off the Tales of Whitnell and I as well. Would have done Alien 3, but they decided not to do it. So it's an interesting one after that, his career in another massive production. But there's also the fact that you've still got Jonathan Harker in Transylvania that just slows everything down as well. There's a lot of sequences that are engaging because you want more of it, but it just feels very surface. And it's just an issue of, like you two said, which is perfect probably response to it, is that he's also having to adapt the material as well. I think there's an issue in this narrative, very much like a vast amount of adaptations, is that he's probably married to the book in a sense of because I think Hannibal and Ridley Scott, I can't remember his last name, Thomas. Oh, can I remember his last name? The guy who wrote the book, Silence of the Lambs, stuff like that. But he was like, "Are you married to your ending?"
Paris.
Yeah,
Yes,
Tom Paris.
Harris.
That's it. It's like, "Are you married to your ending?" He went, "No, great. I'll make my own." I think the issue here is this is such a classic in its own right. You can't ultimately deviate from it from the end of where you're going to get. because of how engrossing and beloved this material is. But I still think he's so inundated with the fact of, oh, I need to do the type of narrative of them writing letters to each other, which is a great way of exposition. It gets rid of all that shit in the book, which I've tried to attempt to do. I find it painful. Christopher Waltz, I remember watching an interview him the other day, said it's like the worst book he's ever read, which I thought was quite interesting. I don't know why that's relevant, but I sort of agree with him. But anyway, back to the point. I think there's an issue where it slows down, quickens up, slows down, quickens up. I also find, I don't know if anyone else agrees with me, it feels wholly repetitive as well. He goes back to the house, he leaves, we cut to Renfield, we might cut to Jonathan Harker, we cut back to Dracula, he goes to the house, we cut back to Renfield. He does it 3 or 4 times from the moment that he gets to London all the way to the end. And there's a point where I sit there and I just sort of think, subconsciously, like, oh, I'm getting slightly tired now. Maybe frustrated is probably the best way, because I expect it to kick on. And then because of that, all of a sudden, she now gets married, which is just, again, we're quickening things up. We have a death sequence of Sadie Frost. Then we're going back to Transylvania. That whole final bit where the brides are there and in the courtyard, how it's shot, how it's edited, it's so frantic. It's so quick in a feature that's taken its time, then slowly had no idea where to go, and then everything happens at the end. I can't tell you if that's a testament to what Hilary and Nick would sort of propose about the book itself, but I think as a narrative on a film level, it has flow issues, it has pacing issues, and if it wasn't so interesting to watch, with Anthony Hopkins and Winona Ryder like making out, I'm like, this is a choice. Or Sadie Frost like they're going down to the grave in that pit, and then you hear this baby cry, and you see a shadow. Like you are you are awoken by the thematic and by the visualization, and you often forget that we've just stopped here, and then we just stopped. Like Tom Waits in a straitjacket, screaming. Everyone else is getting dounced by a hose. You don't know what's going on, but we've just stopped. But it's so interesting with the image, and I do think that's ultimately a Coppola thing, and that's also very relevant in Apocalypse Now as well. A film that goes on and on and on, very repetitive, but he elongates images that are really interesting, and I think here it just about survives.
Mm-hmm.
But even to that degree, I find that the latter half to be stop, start, stop, start. It's like watching Formula One, and then every 10 minutes they just stop and then reset again. It's just very much
Well,
maybe anticlimax. I don't know, anticlimax might not be the word, but it feels very stuttery. I don't know if anyone else agrees.
I don't fully agree, but the best comparison that I can make with this is actually to the Lord of the Rings that Peter Jackson made, the trilogy.
Oh, don't you dare!
No, hear me out. Hear me out. 1 second. In the sense that if you read the books, they're not the most engaging books out there. And what Peter Jackson did was that he translated them, transposed them, and turned them into the most exciting possible version that they could be without betraying the source material. And it's very similar here. And that's one of the reasons why I also think this is the best adaptation. It's because it is the most engaging. Like you're talking start and stop, like almost all of the other Dracula adaptations, especially when you go to like 30s and 50s, is like men in rooms are talking. Oh, we hear noise in the room, and there's Dracula just standing there, and they talk. Maybe he turns into a bat and leaves the room, and the men keep on talking. It's like, holy shit, it's so boring. I mean, I like those movies, but like, it's not cinema per se. And Coppola here makes it the most engaging version possible of the original story, even down to the frantic ending that you described. Like in the book, it's literally, oh, they arrive at the castle, hey, he's in the coffin, boom, he's dead, goes to ash, that's it. And instead here you have the chase with the action and the thing, which is just kind of like, briefly mentioned in the novel. It didn't bother me. That was something that surprised me, because I did remember when I was younger, it felt very long. Um, But this time around, it just flew by because I think all of those scenes, like you say, when they get to London, it slows down a lot. I think that's when it becomes truly its own creature. When you have the seduction of Dracula, where you're always second guessing, like, is it just mental manipulation, trickery, sorcery that is doing on her, or is there actually something genuine? Is she actually the reincarnation of his lost love? You have the scene when they go to the movies for the first time and there's the wolf that comes, and just that entire sequence is so beautiful, which on paper it's a useless sequence that you could cut, but it's essential to the film. I think there's so many little moments like that, where it never really felt boring to me. It never really felt like it slowed down, where it felt like a slog. I don't know, probably Carson feels differently because he said
Oh,
the
well,
pacing.
I can.
Or Hillary.
It's going to be interesting because I think I align a little bit more with Jack on this one. I don't dislike this film, to be clear, but I mean, I wrote down stuff. I said like, this is a bombastic film. It's histrionic. It's visually lush. There's so much like trickery with the camera, but it's also completely unmoored from logic, and in a way that's intentional because I think Coppola said that he was trying to create images that almost kind of would surface from like an erotic dream you had. And I think in that regard, it does work, but it's not particularly, it doesn't make it the kind of film that I identify with or can disappear in. I can see and understand people disappearing into this film and being like, it's because it's about how it makes them feel. It's about the emotional journey rather than everything making sense and hanging together. Like, for me, honestly, a lot of the scenes seem incomplete and they kind of lose focus and nothing really develops naturally. It's kind of cutting back and forth. The scenes sometimes seem more like montages or dream sequences and that are starting in the middle with like no context and then it just end. It's pretty crazy, but it's effective. And there's all these little things too that I think from seeing it on and off over the years, the one thing I do pick up on, and it makes me laugh every time, it's a blooper that I'm not sure people have picked up on, but when I made the supercut of Anthony Hopkins scenes, there's a really jarring blooper where the scene begins and Winona Ryder's at the bottom of a set of garden stairs and starts going up, and that's when she encounters Van Helsing and Seward. But when she goes up the stairs, you can see Hopkins and Richard E. Grant waiting there for their cue to start walking, and it's so awkward. And then the scene just starts, and it's just Hopkins being like, "Mina, you're one of the lights," and he like twirls around and then smells her. Like it's just such a the whole. There's every scene is like that. It's like just really off kilter, and the romance, like I said, isn't completely convincing. And I mean, that could be due to the differences in acting styles between Oldman and Ryder, or what was going on between them at the time. But overall, it doesn't really matter. I think that this really has captured a lot of people. If someone said it was their favorite film of all time, I would kind of get it. But there's too much for me where it's like, I guess the way I put it in my Letterboxd interview is it's like you have a really intense dream and you're completely wrapped up in it. But if it was played back to you, just be like, yeah, it's kind of disjointed and nonsensical. But when I was in it, holy
Oh, I
crap, was
love
it a
that.
ride?
I love
Exactly.
that. Yeah, I love that description. Yeah. I
That's what
mean,
it is to me.
just before I know, Carson, I'll be quick here, but just very briefly here, and it's like the third thing I want to talk about. I find it interesting. The work print, right, is an hour and 55 minutes. The theatrical cut is 2 hours and 3 minutes, and then there's an original cut that he didn't pre-release, which is 2 hours and 35 minutes, which is an interesting one because I think the longer you get here, the worse this will probably be with flow because it'll be more of just talking, like what Nick says. That's the issue. It's an interesting one. I can only go back on the cinematic aspect of it, but I think it just relegates it to self of people talking in rooms. Sadie Frost probably won't die for another hour. But the one thing, and this is like the third thing, just talking about earlier, is that I think there's a reason why he's gone back to The Godfather, why he's gone back to Apocalypse Now, why he's gone back to Twixt. I think he owns the rights to those films, and there's also one that he did. Oh my god, with Richard Gere in 19, and he did another one in 1983. He goes back to certain films, and he does like encore cuts and stuff like that. and it's because he owns the masters. He owns the final negatives of those features because it's all self-financed by American Zoetrope, right? But he's never gone back to this. He's never released that 2.5-hour cut, which I always found really interesting. And this is the third thing. If you read about it, his reason for calling this Bram Stoker's Dracula is because that's what he does. He adds on the novel to it. He adds on Mario Puzo's. He adds on the Outsiders and stuff like that. The reason why they did it here, though, is because Sony couldn't relinquish the Dracula name rights. So that's why it's called Bram Stoker's Dracula, because Dracula's own. I know it's in the public domain, but the iconography, I think, is owned by Universal, which is an issue that Frankenstein also had an issue with, because you can't have the same colour green, which is exactly the same of Wizard of Oz. You can't have that because it's by MGM and Sony or Disney. I think there's an issue there that you can't trademark the copyright, but you can trademark aspects of it. So it's interesting that's why he's never gone back to edit this. And out of everything he's gone back to, regardless of the final cut of Apocalypse Now, which I think is generally almost a joke really at this point, this is probably the one I would love him to go back to and add in chapters, add in a prologue, add in an overture, add in an epilogue, really go deep into the novel aesthetic and really add in all those half an hour, because there's about half an hour deleted scenes on the Blu-ray anyway. Some of it's on the work print. I think this would be fascinating for him to look back on now. And that's the only reason I know I didn't want to cut you up that quick, Carson, but that's the only reason I want to bring up, just because what Hillary said. I think it's be interesting for him to do it as an idea. I'm sure there's a fan of it. I'd love to do my own of it. But I also think that if he does that, I think this film becomes increasingly more unstable with the flow and the weight of it, what it's trying to project. But Carson's going to shit on this now, so go on, Carson.
Well, no, I mean, I don't think we all need to jump on Nick, right? I think we've kind of established that I disagree with him also. I will say two things. Number one, check out our Lord of the Rings Patreon episode, because we did review Lord of the Rings. Also, I just want to get kind of tackle this notion from multiple of you who are like, people standing around in rooms talking is boring, because in that 1930s Dracula, I don't think that's boring in the slightest, because every single scene is escalating. I just want to get away from we're not TikTok brained here. We're not, we're not, maybe if you feel that way, go back to Deadpool and Wolverine. I think the issue here is that it's so repetitive and that it is stale in those scenes. It's not the concept of people standing around talking. Every single thing in that original Dracula, every single moment where there's two people talking in a room is escalating the plot, is escalating the tension. I found. I get why this is someone's favorite film. I'm not shitting on you. Well, I like the film, to be clear. I think we all like the film quite a bit, to be clear. I think we've maybe gone a little bit deep in the negatives. But I get why someone would give this 5 stars. This is not one where I would argue against it, like The Shape of Water last week, where I do think you're kind of, we'll see. But I do appreciate this film for what it is. Maybe moving into final thoughts. Does anyone have anything else about Bram Stoker's Dracula they really want to talk about before we wrap up?
I'd love to ask you a question. I've mentioned this throughout the podcast, but I know that Hillary wasn't there. Nick, I know you were there for some, but for last year, or even a few months ago, we spent hours talking about the Universal Monster series. We've done it multiple times. We always got to bring it back. I just want to ask you as well, because I know you. I'm not too sure if you've seen the Lee version, the Palance, or even the Frank Langella version. How do you compare this to Lugosi then? Do you enjoy this better? I know they're different tones, different types of energies, but I know that one of them is very much one note. To its credit, the other one's a bit more flamboyant. Which one do you prefer?
Well, I've seen the Hammer version also, and that's shit. So I would not just throw that in the bottom tier. For me personally, I would prefer the Lugosi one. The Universal Classic Monsters #1. They're like candy for me. I can watch them anytime. I also think there's and we talked about it. Please go watch our Halloween special. I'm not going to get fully into it, but that is straightforward. But there is so much depth and spirit in there also when it comes to an immigrant perspective, when it comes to drawing that out of the narrative. I think that is very, very rich, and I think it's very effective and very clean. This undeniably is a better production when it comes to costumes, when it comes to sets, when it comes to overall emotional weight. This is clearly better. But if I just had to watch one, I would definitely watch the Lugosi one, just because I think it is so clean and so effective, and the performances are incredible still.
What about this and Lon Chaney Jr.'s then? Dracula.
This. I'd pick this.
What about Robert Carradine's?
This.
Okay.
We're gonna put this is number 2. Let's just put this above all the others.
Okay, I just find it interesting. Yeah, because
Dracula Untold, you know.
Lon Chaney Jr. probably has the more depth out of the 3, which is an interesting one. Robert Carradine gets the image, but Chaney Jr. gets the depth. Whereas here, I think it's everything. But I agree with you. I think it's hard to go against Lugosi. But I'd be interested about Hillary and Nick's as well, because I know it's more of a loaded question, because obviously this is a lot more dimensional. But you know.
I haven't seen as many of the Dracula films as you guys. I think that for me, Lugosi kind of provided his own blueprint that was very, very important and very influential for decades. And then Oldman did his own thing, and that has become a blueprint for a lot of vampire representations after that. So to me, it's a little bit like oranges and apples. But talking about adaptations, I haven't seen this, but have you guys seen Udo Kier's version of Dracula?
No.
How does he fit into things? Because I think that's almost like a queer Dracula, I'm assuming.
What about Dario Argento's Thomas Kretschmann?
No, no. That's one of the worst movies I've ever seen.
It's 131 minutes, by the way.
Oh, good lord. That doesn't sound good.
I'm watching it. I can't wait.
No,
it's considered the worst adaptation.
It's together with like Dracula 3000, whatever nonsense on the spaceship.
With Gerard Butler.
Oh, that was, I will give that one credit because of the Judas thing. That was clever, where it reveals that Dracula's actually Judas and why he's averse to silver and the crucifix. I'm like, that's clever, but the movie is pretty mediocre.
I'm going to say something here, right? And I'm going to get crucified for this, ironically enough. I think one of the best Draculas is the one out of Van Helsing.
Oh. That was a fun one. That was a fun one.
I haven't seen
that. A really good
one. I don't remember. What's
his name? The Mission Impossible 2 villain.
Oh, Martin Sokas? I think that's
No. He's the main one. It's like his side villain.
Oh, yeah. They're going to get the pinky cut.
Yes.
You're right. Yeah.
I thought you were going to say Renfield, Jack. I was like, I'm not doing that.
Oh, no, I did not like Renfield. That movie didn't know what it was. It drove me crazy.
Jack loved it. Be nice.
I really enjoyed it.
Oh, no.
I did like Cage's performance and the very beginning where they recreated the Dracula, the 1931 version. I thought if the whole movie had just been a remake of Dracula in black and white, I probably would have enjoyed it more. But once it got into the actual film, I thought, I don't know what this is for. I don't know what this is supposed to be.
There's Aquafina, Ben Schwartz.
Yeah, there's 3 editors on it. It was a mess.
Aquafina. I also want to shout out, I really like Blackula. I love that film.
Blackula's very
really
cool.
Oh,
yeah.
I haven't seen that one, but I bet it's great.
you should watch the 2020 BBC production of Dracula. I think you'd like it. It's very much a bit of both worlds. I think you'd like. What are you shaking your head for?
No. That's I would put it top 10 worst adaptations of Dracula.
Really?
It's trash.
To be fair,
it's it's 3 episodes. First episode, okay, this is alright. Second episode, third episode is atrocious. It's horrendous.
Okay, I'll ask you this then: that or Dracula Untold?
Dracula Untold.
Oh, I need to leave here.
I have seen that one. I blocked it out. I don't remember it.
No, it's not that bad though. Let's be clear. Dracula Untold is not good, but it's not that bad.
It's not that bad. No, it's not. It's not. No, if I were to say, for me, Dracula, I think every Dracula adaptation has its own flavor, has its own taste, and so depending on the mood, you can gravitate to one or the other. I think this one has the full package. As we talked about, it has a little bit of everything. It even has references to Nosferatu by Murnau from the 20s. So I think I would probably always go for this one, even though I'm saving one film for later on.
Well, I think I want to learn what it is. So let's get into our question of the week, which is our favorite vampire film. Nick, I'm beyond curious now. What is your pick?
I have, I thought long and hard. There's so many vampire movies that I love. So I had to pick 2.
Sure.
One of them, because they're very different.
Oh, you don't do it every week, Jack.
Exactly.
Jesus. You would have come with 8 different picks. Calm down.
No. I want to know what's coming, man. I'm desperate.
Abel Ferrara's The Addiction. I absolutely Love that film. It uses vampirism in so many interesting ways to tackle, as one might expect, addiction, um, and just mortality as well. And it's very philosophical and it's very Ferrara, like up its own ass, but also beautiful in its own way. I really, really love that. But surprisingly, a movie that I loved on first viewing, and I thought this is not going to hold up through the years, but it actually has. And I think about it more often than I would like to admit. It's actually one that Hillary mentioned earlier, starring Udo Kier. It's Blood for Dracula. I
Mm.
love that film. I think it's camp and it's Euro trash. It's kind of like a John Waters movie. You know, it was directed by is it Paul Morrissey? Yeah, Paul Morrissey, Andy Warhol production with Udo Kier being Dracula when he's drinking the blood of virgins and he goes to, you know, central Italy when there's no virgins and he starts infiltrating a castle where there's these incestuous sisters that are all not virgins, and he starts drinking their blood, and then he vomits because they're not virgins, and you know it gets very gay, it gets very bloody, but it is incredibly sad. It's one of those, like, the main musical theme. Just go listen to it after you're done with this recording. Even listeners, like, go listen to the main theme from Blood for Dracula, and you're like, oh my god, this is going to be one of the saddest movies ever. And in a way, it kind of is. More than any other film, I think it captures the sadness of Dracula as a character, which from a piece of Euro trash you would not expect. Um, that's why The Addiction and Blood for Dracula are tied for my favorite vampire movies, because they're also the ones that I think about the most, in a way.
Nice. Jack, what are your selections?
Dracula Feet. No, I'm joking. I actually have two. I was been joking before.
Ah,
The fact that no one's mentioned this, the Stephen Norrington classic Blade,
That's true. It's a
top
vampire
tier,
movie.
not
top
the Del
tier.
Toro sequel. No.
No, not
Okay.
for me. No. It is. It is. To be fair, it is very good though. But the first one to me with the New Order, um, the nightclub sequence at the beginning, traumatic. Him in like Central Park, just killing like things, and yeah, Stephen Dorff, classic, very early DVD. I had by Entertainment Video, wonderful. I generally thought you were going to do Shadow of the Vampire, Willem Dafoe doing the Nosferatu thing. I thought you were going to go that niche. I hope no one else brought that one up. I have a bit of a backstory to this, and nobody talks about this film. When I went to Seattle at Halloween, my wife took me there, and we watched Halloween in the cinema and stuff like that. It was really cool. And she said the MoMA there, the Art Institute, the museum, they're gonna have a cinema night each 1 week on Halloween, so four screenings, just random Halloween movies. Do you want to go? And I think it probably took me a lot of like courage to go and do it, because I was like, I'd rather just go back and just explore the city. She's like, no, we should do it. I'd like to do it. And I don't really like watching films with my wife, because she's A, doesn't either like them, or B, watches them because I like it. And I find that weird. I don't really want her to feel like she's wasting her time, especially with something I didn't know if it was going to be good. And all they said it was called The Transfiguration. Okay. And I sat there with about 60 of the people. Nobody spoke, and in what felt like a school assembly, they just projected this film about a young black kid in the Bronx who could be 12, 13, 14, lives in the projects, brothers with gangs, and this kid slowly but surely loses touch with reality and thinks he's a vampire. And he kills a few people and tries to drink blood and stuff like that. And it's a very subtextual heavy film about gang violence, and it has a horrifying finale which you don't really see coming, but when you watch it after the fact, it sort of feels like inevitable, regardless of what's going to happen. The reality of the system, the reality of where he lives, the reality of, unfortunately, because of the colour of his skin, his destiny is almost very tragically has already got a finale. It's very brutal to watch. It's only about an hour and 27 minutes. And I remember really enjoying it. I was like, oh, shit, that was really good. One on Letterboxd, everyone hates it. 2-star, 1-star. And I remember people really, really disliked it. And it's always stayed with me. And I've never seen it since. But it's one of those films where it's very much like the first Dracula, 1931, where there's a context, there's a subtext, and Bela Lugosi about othering, about a foreign language, a foreign visitor, with English women, the patriarchy, intertwining racial prejudice, and then you watch this, and it's like it's so much more profound and poignant, and it gets that theme of context of what it's just a kid thinking he's a vampire, and then it has the subtext of everything in it, and I think it's a fascinating film. Really terrific little feature film that MoMA presented. So that would be my second one. But this was a hard one, but Blade and Transfiguration.
I'm like 90% sure that was nominated for a Spirit Award, and I've been waiting to watch it for like ever. So I added it to my
Oh
Halloween
my
watch list.
god,
So
yeah.
we'll see.
I would love to get your opinion on that. I would love to.
Hillary, what are your favorite vampire films?
I actually have a list on Letterboxd called Vampire Films That Don't Suck. And I'll be adding that to the list. I have a Letterboxd list called Recommendations from Podcasts. So if you find that list, and I think it'll be in the description area because I can't directly link it or whatever, it should be in there. But I did choose two. I guess that's kind of becoming a trend. The first one I want to mention is Only Lovers Left Alive, the Jim Jarmusch film with Tilda Swinton and Tom Hiddleston, Mia Wasikowska, and Anton Yelkin. I am a Jarmusch fan, so maybe I'm a bit biased in that regard. And I think what has made it a favorite for me is that it's not so much about um, hunting people down or sucking blood or human vampire relations or anything. I think it's more of a study of time, more what it'd be like to be alive for that long and what that does to somebody. Especially the contrast between the Hiddleston and Swinton characters. And then my second choice is on the other end of the spectrum, which is the mockumentary What We Do in the Shadows. That is such a funny film, and I was
Outstanding.
yes, I was so resistant to seeing it when someone introduced the film to me. She hadn't seen it either, to be clear, because I'd seen Eagle versus Shark and Boy, the other Taika Waititi films before this, and I didn't like them. They were kind of have like a bitter taste, the comedy, and the characters aren't very likable. So I was like, oh, I don't know if I want to watch this. Like, is it going to be more? And then I watched it, and I loved it, and I love the mockumentary format. I love all the jokes. I love the characters, because it's also, I think what these two films I mentioned have in common is that it's less about blood sucking. It's more about just how much you struggle with time changing, and then being out of touch with what you're doing, and just how no matter how many hundreds of years you're around, you're still going to argue with your roommates about how someone hasn't done the dishes for 87 years. It's very ripe for comedy, and they did a fantastic job.
I also have two choices. To reiterate, I really like Dracula. I think like a lot of people hear that film or watch that film and kind of leave it at its initial concept as being comedic, but there's a lot of like social commentary and relevance there that makes it a very rich experience. Also, Nick, I have to thank you for this one. About a year after we talked about in our rapid reviews, I think it was, Humanist Vampire Seeking Consenting Suicidal Person is so good.
Wow,
and it's finally
excellent.
out where you can watch it at home. So I would highly recommend that. Very funny, very brilliant take on kind of deconstructing the vampire lore and adding a lot to it. I don't want to spoil much, but that's a film that like still
So
as
good.
one of those little indie festival gems that has stuck with me, and I'm so happy it actually got released. It is haunting if you cover the film festival circuit as a critic and you watch like a lot of those smaller films, because there are so many like 4 to 5 star films that just never get released, that will never see the time of day. And thank God this is one that like got attention and got a distributor and is out there because it is so good. So I would highly recommend that. With that, let's get to our rapid reviews. Anything we've seen this week that we haven't discussed on the podcast. Hillary, take it away. What have you seen this week?
Oh my God. I have seen a lot. And so I wrote down a list, and I'm like been trying to cross things off. Maybe I should just keep things as simple as possible. I did see Peter Watkins' work for the first time. So I watched Punishment Park and The War Game. These are very serious mockumentaries about war and potential like kind of a collapse of society issues. the War Games about an atomic blast in Britain, and then Punishment Park is about the U.S. Holding like a kind of like kangaroo courts for people they consider dissidents, and then forcing them to participate in something that's just awful. I would recommend watching Rebel Ridge on Netflix. I do like Jeremy Saulnier, and I wasn't familiar with Aaron Pierre other than his work in Old, which is not a very good representation of him as an actor. But I really enjoyed it. It's a very tight, engaging, crazy film to watch. I think some people kind of call it like dad material, like dad movie material. And I guess that I'm a dad because I really enjoyed watching this. I don't know. There's something very liberating about watching a black man disarm police officers, but then not kill them and still outwitting them at every turn. It's just a very involving story. And then lastly, this is kind of a surprise. I've really gotten into this YouTube channel called Hollywood Mysteries, and so I've been revisiting a lot of older actors that from the golden age of Hollywood, their lives and stuff. And after learning a bit more about William Powell, I rewatched My Man Godfrey, and I was completely engaged the whole time. That movie is so funny because the conceit is basically a homeless man gets adopted by like an extremely eccentric and crazy rich family, and every scene is just watching William Powell like deadpan reacting to like how nuts everyone is worth watching the entire film for. So those are my recommendations.
Jack, what have you seen this week?
Tragically, I've just seen 2 films. I'm going to upset a few people here. I don't really have a lot of time at the moment, but spare time, because what I do for a living with my job, so my time is very sparse. However, I've been meaning to sort of go to the cinema and watch stuff, and The Substance been playing, Lee's been playing, Speak No Evil's been playing, but there was a double showing of Borderlands and The Crow, and I felt compelled to go watch them both back to back. I'll start with Borderlands. It's just trash. It's just trashy nonsense. I think editing's horrific. I think the lighting in it is appalling. I think none of it comes together very well. I think the production design is dire. I think performances are so comatose. Everyone is trying to do something there and be witty and scream and shout, "Look at me!" And I think everyone just looks a prat. Like it's just constant narration and constant aggravating the viewer. I don't know where you fall from that. That was shot in 2021. It got released this year to a 0%. I don't think it deserves a 0%. It's just terrible. But I don't think it's the worst thing ever. But it is generally terrible. I'll go with The Crow here, right? I actually watched The Crow with my mom. And my mom had just seen the original Crow. She's seen it years ago. But she was watching it on Amazon Prime. And she watched Crow. She watched a sequel of it. I've seen all of them very recently for my sins. And we watched it. It's really not that bad. However, it has major, and I mean major, tonal issues. It's a film that has high-octane energy. It has something to say. But very much unlike the 1994 version, it does not have any heart. It has absolutely no emotive weight. It has no warmth. Now, granted, the 1994 version is elevated because of the passing of Brandon Lee, which makes the story and the context of that film, as well as the subtext, work in tangent to be very, very, very emotional. And because it works in the narrative of giving someone a final bit of an hors d'oeuvre, I think it works lovely. This one is someone has watched that and thought, what we'll do is we'll take Scandinavian rapper aesthetic like Young Lean, we'll throw it on Bill Skarsgård, we'll get FK Twigs to be in it because they can sell tickets. We won't change their accent though, and he'll struggle with his, and we'll present it in a Blade Runner like grunge aesthetic. and it's very poor. I think it tries its best at giving 40 minutes of character development, and then it just goes into The Crow to a totally different film. Like Danny Houston's in here possessed or like telling people to do things to the other people, and they do it, but no one talks about it, and it's just an action romp. I'll say this: there's a sequence. I don't know if anyone's seen it here. There's a sequence in an opera house that goes on for about 20 minutes, and to say it is gory is an understatement. Bill Skarsgård walks in with like fucking Dennis Reynolds of Always Sunny, nothing on but a duster, with makeup all over his face and a samurai sword, and chops people to pieces in very interesting and quite fun ways. If he's stabbed, he'll purposely fall back onto someone to kill them. It's very ingenious and very fun, but it makes nothing of a substance. It's just a set piece. He'll then walk on stage with two severed heads, as if to be like, look at me, and it's ironic because the film feels like that as well. It's like it's screaming to like, I'm doing something, and it's like watching a child like jump off a curb or something. To them, it's quite a massive achievement, but it's very much like, okay, like, oh, I drew a picture, and it's like, oh, it's really good, and it's just like a dog. Like there's levels of it, I suppose. Not to shit on kids who draw like that, but development. But it was just very, very poor. And then there's a final piece where it's like, what? Like, is there like a sequel here? Like, I don't know what's going on. But it just made me want to watch the actual original cut of Alex Proyas' work print with Michael Barrymore, who was in Hills of Eyes, play the cowboy and stuff. It was interesting. I'll say this: out of the two of them, I think The Crow probably deserved a little bit more appreciation because there's a lot more backstory to go into that and how it was going to be annihilated. I think quite unfairly, but it is just a very subpar remake. Both of them were bad. The Crow's not that bad, to be fair, but the Borderlands was like dire. But we the substance was there, and decided to watch those two. So
I think any other film playing was there, and you chose your options.
Oh yeah,
so,
yeah.
I mean,
I
good
can
on
watch
you.
Inside Out too. Yeah.
Sure. Nick, what have you seen recently?
I've been going a lot to the cinema, which has been very, very fun. I've been watching a lot of things, but just like 2 or 3 highlights. I finally watched Longlegs, which
Oh
I
boy.
enjoyed. I think it's very flawed because the crime aspect of it, I don't think it's as intriguing as it thinks it is. I think it should have been a bit harder on the paranormal side of things, potentially. But I do really like where it goes, where it ends up. I think Alicia Witt especially steals the film. But I also really like Nicolas Cage. It's a type of movie I'm glad I managed to watch on the big screen. I knew it came out on VOD, but I was like, I'm gonna wait, and I managed to watch it with a sold-out crowd, shockingly. Like almost 2 months since it's been out here as well. Like people love Longlegs, I'm very happy for them. But I still really much enjoyed it. Another highlight, I rewatched Mulholland Drive on the big screen, which is always great. I finally watched Perfect Days on the big screen, which has been amazing. Just, a lot of quality cinema. But the best film that I've seen the entire month, a strong contender for best film of the year, a Nick certified banger is The Substance. I adored The Substance. I think this movie is everything that I want out of body horror, satires, dark comedies. It's a film that doesn't take itself seriously. It's incredibly gruesome and fun and thought-provoking, completely unsubtle, but because of that, it forces you to think about different layers that the film presents. Demi Moore has never been this good. She has never been able to play a character this vulnerable. More than anything, this is a film about self-hate and how much we are our own worst enemy, which is something I can often relate to. And it is absolutely batshit crazy. And when people tell you, like people told me, like, oh my god, the final 20 minutes, 30 minutes are crazy. And the movie reached a point where I thought it was ending. And I was like, holy shit, they were right. This is fucking insane. And then the movie actually goes on for another 30 minutes. And where it goes, like, I am shocked that there are people that watch the entire film and say, like, oh, this was a bit sillier, like, oh, blah. It's like the movie is completely self-aware. There's no way you reach the ending and think they are not in on the joke. And in a very sick way, which is always what I like about some films like this, in a very sick way, it becomes so cartoonish, then it becomes very poignant to the point that the final 2 minutes of the film almost made me tear up in a way that I was not expecting. And for the first time ever, at a normal screening with a normal audience, packed house, people clapped. People clapped when the movie finished, which I was like, I am shocked, but also I felt like I needed that catharsis. I felt like I needed to like just like put my energy and the stress and the tension and the laughter and everything just like into something, and so you just want to clap by the time it ends. I'm going to see it again tomorrow because a friend wants to watch it, and there's another packed screening, and like I'm gonna go there. So if anyone like go watch it now, go watch it when the cinemas are full, go watch it with groups of friends. You're gonna have a blast. Even people that are not into body horror, it's very akin to early Sam Raimi, early Peter Jackson, in the sense that it's incredibly grim, but with such a strong humorous vein to it that it makes it more watchable than if it were more serious. I think, like as a closing statement on substance, I think Titan is way more impactful and disturbing, but this is like 100 times worse in terms of gore and just graphic content. But it hits on a less disturbing level. I don't know if any of that made sense.
No, it did.
It did.
It did. And I would just want to tell you that you're talking about being your own worst enemy or having self-loathing. And I just want to say, don't do that. I know it's it's useless to say that to someone who has their own like inner like I don't like using the word inner demons, but yeah, you're
Sometimes it
perfect.
fits.
You're fine just the way you are. You know,
Appreciate it.
change, but don't change. It's fine.
That's something that's very beautiful about the movie, I think. It's a film about self-hate and also learning self-love, in a way.
In the bloodiest way possible. I'm curious about this
In
one because
the
I didn't like.
bloodiest way.
Yeah, the bloodiest way. Because I liked Raw, but I didn't like Titan. So I'm wondering if the substance. I could go one way or the other. I'm very
Did
curious
you
because of what
watch
you said now.
Revenge?
I did
Have you
see
seen
Revenge, and
Revenge?
I didn't like Revenge.
Okay.
No, I
Then
didn't. It was too out there for me. But the substance might be a totally different beast. You never know. So I'll go
it
check
is
it out for
very
sure.
out there. It
Yes.
is very out there.
I feel bad that me and Jakku podcast with Nick every week. Nick is saying this, and we're like, yeah, whatever. And Hillary's the one who has to jump in and be like, don't hate yourself.
Yeah,
We love you
don't.
all, so Nick.
It's another podcast where like we just it's like about mental health issues and emotional support. But yeah, anyone on this podcast they were saying that, I would say the same thing.
Yeah.
Appreciate
it.
Okay, let's get through what I've watched. I watched the original Dracula again. I have loved going through this series of this Road to Halloween and starting the week with watching the original. I think for both this and Shape of Water, it's added a lot of richness. And like I said, those originals are like candy to me. So I greatly enjoyed that. I caught up with Max's limited series Chimp Crazy, which is about this wacko woman. This is the same guy who did Tiger King. It's kind of that, but with chimpanzees. Major flaws here when it comes to focus. To get this thing into 4 episodes, they have to like inject all this information about other chimpanzee situations that have nothing to do with the case you're watching. I'm very like into the Wild Pilled right now because I'm teaching that right now, and that's a book that had so much like it compares other situations to build a single thesis. Chimp Crazy does not do that. It just has like extended sequences talking about these random chimpanzees. Some great twists and turns here if you like that in true crime. Like the perspective they get on this is shocking. But overall, kind of iffy. I would recommend like if it starts talking about another chimpanzee, just skip ahead 30 minutes in the episode and then like keep going and you'll be great. That's really how I'd recommend watching it.
Are they feature lengths like Tiger King?
It's an hour each episode, yeah. So 4 hours total. I mean, I would say overall it's worth it for like there are some twists in here that are like I'm telling you, like, it's insane. I was like screaming. On Netflix, Uglies is absolutely fucking atrocious, as everyone expected.
God.
I finally caught up with The First Omen. Really fun. Wild that this came out the same year as Immaculate.
Yep.
look, Tiger Free is my queen from Servant. There was news that they're making a Joan of Arc movie, and everyone had these awful takes this week about who should play Joan of Arc. Put Neil Tiger Free in this. She is phenomenal. I'm so happy she gets a showcase like The First Omen, which is quite good. Though I prefer Immaculate a little bit more. I'm continuing with my Schrader month. Focusing this week, I watched some films that he wrote but didn't direct. Old Boyfriends is fucking atrocious, I'll be honest. But Scorsese's The Last Temptation of Christ is fantastic, of course.
Wow.
A humanization of Christ in a way that, like, I know it's a lot of controversy. A lot of people hate what this film does. I don't know if there's ever been a more compelling look at the power of faith and the sacrifice in this Christian story. The one issue is it does try to subvert expectations a little bit by the end, and you are waiting for the shoe to drop because it's so obvious that the shoe is going to drop, and it goes like for an extended amount of time where I'm like, maybe they are going in a different direction, and then it just drops at the end. So it's like, okay, why did we do this for 20 minutes? But really enjoyed that film. What Scorsese or what Schrader did direct, Autofocus was quite good. Early Schrader has this thing with, and I felt the same way with Mishima, where like his early biopics are really interesting, but now Schrader would ask some deeper questions of his subjects to where like, this is good, but it's not great. Dying of the Light was awful. Schrader should be like on his knees thanking God that the studio interfered, because there are clear issues with this film from what Schrader was even presenting, but the studio got involved, so now all the blame can go to them. The reason this is shit is clearly the studio, not at all anything Schrader ever would do. I rewatched Light Sleeper, which might be like the most underrated Schrader film. I love that movie so much. Willem Dafoe is fantastic here. Also, the one he wrote, Mosquito Coast. Look, I had no expectations for this film, and like it is. If anyone's following current American politics, like current this month American politics, this film is like so disturbingly relevant with some of the concepts it tackles, some of the language it uses. Had no idea this was going to be so relevant, but a quite decent film actually. And then ending with two other random old things that I watched. Finally watched Zodiac for the first time. Fantastic film. Fincher's feature.
God.
Which cut, Carson?
Theatrical. I didn't do the directors. Really interesting in perspective. It is a story that offers no grace to the person telling the story, because it does end with like a really lackluster conclusion in real life. So you have to take an interesting angle for the actual narrative to work in a film. And I thought Fincher did really good here. And then finally, off the strong recommendation of Jack last week, I did watch Jason X. And I must say, loved it. Of course I loved it. This is easily, I'll be honest, easily my favorite film of the Friday the 13th franchise. By far. This is the only one I'd rewatch. It's campy. It's fun. It understands exactly what it's being. Not necessarily like, I would not obviously give this 5 stars, but it is very, very fun. And this is definitely one I would revisit again. Really like surpassed all my expectations, so I'm happy. And Nick, you've also recommended it previously to me. I would happy you guys did, because I did love Jason X, probably like too much. But finally I have my film in the Friday the 13th franchise that I'm like, that's mine, because I didn't have it before this and now I love it, so we're good. With that's gonna do it for today on the episode. Where can we find everyone on social media? Nick, kick us off.
You can find me on Instagram and Twitter at NickyGrand97 with links to everything there.
Jack?
You can find me on Letterboxd and Twitter or X with the username at Jak-Luke Sharp, and you can find my writings on Clapper.
Thank God you didn't try to sing that. Hillary?
The easiest way to find me would be on Letterboxd. I'm under the name Degelle, Deglelle. And if you go there, you'll see a link to campsite.bio, and that will take you to everything that I'm doing. And on Letterboxd, of course, you'll find the list I mentioned, recommendations for podcasts. You can find links to everything here. Just as a quick aside, and this is a little bit unrelated, because I know we talked about Dracula and we talked about Longlegs, speaking of like really opposing performances, controversial performances as far as like a villain in the film. This week, I just have to mention this. There's the podcast Comedy Bang Bang. It's an improvisational podcast. Taran Killam, the comedian, appeared on the podcast for an hour and a half as Longlegs for an hour and a half. And it was some of the funniest shit I've ever heard. Just that voice the whole time. And he's just like excited about birthdays, and he's going to make a doll of everybody. So please check that out. And it does demonstrate to me, relating to this podcast, how even a film that isn't that old immediately starts reverberating through pop culture. And Dracula has done that too. I love seeing weird, obscure memes of Dracula show up in weird places. I'll add a link to the recommendation from podcast lists. One of my favorite artists, Perfume Genius, memed Dracula on Twitter, and it's so funny to me. So I'll add a link to his tweet from a year ago about Dracula. And yes, that's it for me.
Love it. You can find me on Twitter at BP_movie reviews. Letterboxd just Carson Timar. Thank you so much for listening. We'll be back right here on the main feed in 2 weeks as we continue these Universal Monster retellings as we review from earlier this year, Lisa Frankenstein. I'm very excited to get into that film, one I expected absolutely nothing from. And I ended up having a pretty good time. I think we're going to have a good time talking about it. So with that, we'll see you then. Goodbye.